Being a teenager in the late 1990s, I remember a surge of romantic comedies aimed at my generation. One in particular stands out as relevant to this review. She's All That. A movie that was released in 1999 about a girl who's considered to be nerdy and unattractive, and becomes the target of a bet from a popular football player and his friends. The bet was that he can make the nerdy girl of the school the prom queen by the end of the school year. The moral of the story was that, of course, that she was beautiful and a great person the entire time. Final Fantasy VII is the She's All That of RPGs. Prior to its release, the JRPG genre was a nerdy, unappreciated storytelling medium, and after giving it a makeover, it highlights the genre in a way that hadn't been done so before. So let's swap out these paint-encrusted overalls, let our hair down, and find out why Final Fantasy VII is the prom queen of JRPG High. To properly discuss the transformation of the genre of RPGs, we need to discuss the state of the franchise and its prominence in gaming leading up to the release of Final Fantasy VII. In the mid-1990s, the idea of RPGs in general were nowhere near as ubiquitous to gaming as it is present day. In the West specifically, though many titles prior to Final Fantasy VII weren't necessarily considered commercial failures, there really hadn't been anything that would be considered a breakout success either. Squaresoft was still looking to substantially break into the West, and a technologically shifting gaming landscape would prove to be the perfect opportunity. Final Fantasy VII originally started development in 1994 for the Super Nintendo, and even had a 2D prototype, but was put on halt to help finish up this very little known JRPG gem called Chrono Trigger. I don't know, I've never heard of it. Once Chrono Trigger was completed in 1995, the team went back to Final Fantasy VII discussions. At this time, there was a lot of hype around the upcoming 3D game consoles. Yoshinori Kitase, a director for Squaresoft, was concerned that the genre and franchise would be left behind if they did not evolve for the 3D platform. Squaresoft decided that they wanted Final Fantasy VII to release on a 3D console due to the highly successful tech demo utilizing Final Fantasy VI characters and the increasing costs of cartridges. Squaresoft had several choices as to which platform they would develop for: the Nintendo 64, Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the Windows operating system were all in the discussions for launch. The Nintendo 64 was specifically targeted due to the long-standing relationship that Nintendo and Squaresoft had up until this point. Tests were made for the Nintendo 64's disk drive peripheral system, and after an abysmal frame rate and estimated 30 discs to run the game, Squaresoft chose the Sony PlayStation and the superior storage capacity of the CD-ROM for Final Fantasy VII. Not only did they choose Sony for Final Fantasy VII, but would continue to do so for all future projects. Returning for the development of Final Fantasy VII was longtime director and producer Hironobu Sakaguchi, who would step in as the producer role, allowing Yoshinori Kitase to return as the director after successfully directing Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Also returning from Final Fantasy VI would be the designer Yasuke Naroa, who would be filling the role of art director. Naroa stated that he needed to relearn how to draw, as bringing things into a 3D world would be quite a change from 2D. He would later describe the art direction of Final Fantasy VII to be weird and dark. The Shinra logo was personally designed and drawn by Naroa. Yoshitaka Amano, who was present in the franchise since its initial inception, created the logo from the game, and utilized the color blue to signify the ecological themes of the story, and green to signify the light from Midgar and the life stream. The coloring of the logo directly influenced the overall color direction of the game, as many areas are bathed in either blue or green specifically. Nomura was another artist that was brought on, and impressed Sakaguchi with his copious handwritten notes of ideas of characters and scenarios instead of having them typed out. Nomura was the main character designer and took great inspiration from Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro in their rivalry while designing Cloud and Sephiroth. Sephiroth was specifically to be designed as kakoi, which in Japanese term that combines good looks and coolness. If you're like me and thought that Zack and Cloud looked awfully alike, you aren't the only one. Originally, Cloud was designed to have black hair slicked back to save on the polygon count and to contrast Sephiroth's long flowing silver hair. However, Nomura feared that such masculinity wouldn't do well with the fans, so the change was made to make him spiky blonde. Nomura was actually involved in the battle process as well, and invented the now infamous limit break system after refining the desperation attacks that were present in Final Fantasy VI. With the success of Final Fantasy VI in Japan, Squaresoft was able to keep a passion-oriented development model at its core and would not be limited due to resources, allowing them to make the game exactly as they wanted to make it. The average video game team of this time was around 20 people. However, Squaresoft would have between 100 and 150 people working on Final Fantasy VII. It would become the most expensive video game release to date, a record lasting until Star Wars: The Old Republic was released in 2011. Not taking inflation into account, Final Fantasy VII would cost $45 million to develop. A 3-month marketing campaign in the US amounting to a staggering $100 million, consisting of ads during Saturday Night Live, The Simpsons, ESPN, and MTV. They also had print adverts in magazines and even in DC and Marvel comic books. Squaresoft realized that there was a lot riding on the success of Final Fantasy VII, and they were willing to spend a huge amount of money to ensure it. The West was tasked with selling 500,000 copies of this game to be considered a success. Within 12 months, 3 million units were sold in the US alone, which were numbers typically only seen from flagship franchises like Mario or Sonic. Final Fantasy VII won numerous Game of the Year awards and was acknowledged by Sony for boosting the sales of the PlayStation console and popularizing Japanese role-playing games worldwide. Critics praised its graphics, gameplay, music, and story. However, the English localization would generate some criticism, as many phrases haven't necessarily aged well. Final Fantasy VII would be so iconic that many additional titles were released within its universe, which I will cover in future videos. The initial plot and setting was drastically different to the game that would eventually release. Final Fantasy VII was first envisioned as modern-day noir set in New York City, which would eventually go on to inspire the setting for Parasite Eve. Sakaguchi wanted to focus on the idea that a character dying didn't mean that they were necessarily gone, and to show death in a more realistic way, as opposed to the overdone Hollywood grandeur that was used for previous deaths in the franchise. Kitase further iterated upon this concept, depicting death as a very sudden and unexpected, trying to relay a grand emptiness, not overly dramatic, just feelings of reality. These ideas were the main influence for the live stream and how the dead react to it. The team even toyed with the idea of having most of the main characters die shortly before the final battle, but Nomura vetoed the idea as he felt it would undermine the impact of a certain someone's death. Scenario writer Kazushige Nojima and Yoshinori Kitase stated in an interview that Spira from Final Fantasy X is the ancestor civilization which colonized the planet of Final Fantasy VII. This is reinforced by Shinra in Final Fantasy X, mentioning potentially harnessing the far plane as an energy source, which his descendants would go on to do with a life stream many centuries later, as the Shinra Electric Power Company. The direction of the writing was similar to Final Fantasy VI, in that the team wanted more speaking between the characters where they would argue and raise objections, which would slow down the pacing of the story, but help to flesh out the characters to make them feel more believable. Voice acting was also something that was originally on the table for the game, but was omitted due to the amount of load time that it would add. Several of the late game scenes were written by Masato Kato, including the live stream sequence and Cloud and Tifa's conversation before the final battle. Initially unaffiliated with the project, Kato was called on to help add some meat to the less important story scenes, but he later regretted writing his scenes to his own tastes without outside consultation. The music of Final Fantasy VII is, in my personal opinion, one of, if not the best, overall soundtracks from veteran franchise composer Nobuo Uematsu. The theme of the soundtrack matches the theme of the game. It is melancholic, yet hides a veil of hopefulness. Some tracks like Aerith's theme and Desert Wasteland obviously exude sadness. Many others still have an underlying somber tone like On Our Way or Cid's theme, which has elements to it which build up the character, and also symbolizes the moment when he was brought back down to Earth, quite literally. With the hardware upgrades, it allowed for an auditory fidelity not realized in previous entries. Utilizing a full orchestra, Nobuo Uematsu was able to bring several tracks to life, most notably the famous Final Fantasy piece, One Winged Angel. Now, we discussed leitmotifs at length in our Final Fantasy VI review, but another way that Uematsu masterfully crafts it into the soundtrack is by taking a recurring theme, in this case Aerith's theme, and manipulating it within several different tracks. This could also be why much of this soundtrack sounds so melancholy, as it is tied to a significant event within the story, so it subconsciously pulls at your heartstrings every single time that it plays. Some of my personal favorites of this soundtrack are Costa del Sol, Birth of a God, and Under the Rotting Pizza. That's why I decided to do a mashup of all three for this review entitled Birth of a Soul-Rotting Pizza God. The gameplay of Final Fantasy VII is the most streamlined and refined to date. Returning once again, smoother than ever, is the ATB battle system, allowing for quick inputs in battles. Magic and skills are handled by the new materia system, which improves upon the idea of espers from Final Fantasy VI. Instead of equipping an esper to teach the character spells, the player can equip some materia which will adjust the player's stats and allow the character to utilize skills and/or magic that they weren't able to before. The amount of materia a character can equip is determined by how many materia slots their equipment can hold, forcing you to balance the materia carefully. Final Fantasy VII is the simplest game to date in regards of equipment, only having 3 total items that can be equipped per character: a weapon, a piece of armor, and an accessory. However, there is a deceptive complexity in the strategy of choosing the correct materia that is attached to the equipment. Some materia slots in the equipment will only work for one materia. However, some are joined together, allowing for additional functionality. For instance, you can have a restore materia linked to an all materia, which gives the character the ability to cast cure on all party members. Or you can pair an ice materia with an elemental materia on your armor and absorb ice damage. The possibilities and absolutely absurd combinations that can be added to a character's inventory is astounding. When a player is victorious in battle, in addition to earning experience points, enemies will provide ability points as well. Ability points are essentially experience points for your materia. As your materia levels up, it bestows more abilities. For instance, leveling up the restore materia will allow your character to cast better cure spells, such as Cura or Curaga. Leveling up the all materia allows the character to cast whatever tied spell more times in combat. For example, if you have a level 3 all materia and a level 2 restore, you can cast Cure 3 times, but also be able to cast Cura 3 times on all party members per battle. The materia system addition allows for a ton of customization, allowing someone to find powerful combos, but also simplistic enough for the average or beginner player to just dive right into the game and feel as though they are progressing towards something. As stated earlier, Final Fantasy VII is the first in the franchise to have limit breaks, which is when a character has taken a certain amount of damage, they can unleash a devastating attack. Each character has multiple limit breaks, and almost all of them have an item that is found somewhere in the game that unlocks their final limit break, which is generally their most powerful one. The limit break system is also another aspect of Final Fantasy VII that helps to reinforce the characters themselves. I often found myself filling my party with the characters specifically because of their limit breaks. This solves an issue that I had with Final Fantasy VI, which by the end of the game they all generally felt the same due to relics or magic being so strong that you rarely used the skills that made those characters unique. My favorite party has always been Cloud, Cid, and Vincent. However, if I am min-maxing around the limit breaks, I typically choose Cloud, Barret, and Cid. What's your favorite party? Let me know in the comments. The limit break function would become a staple of not only the franchise, but also of the genre as a whole. Many games would take inspiration from the limit break system and either copy it outright or add something similar to it in their games. Now I know I have been singing the praises of Final Fantasy VII, and rightfully so, but now I must discuss something that really changed the landscape of the genre in, well, arguably a negative way. Minigames. Holy crap, does Final Fantasy VII have a lot of minigames. And I'm not talking about the Gold Saucer, which is literally a pool of minigames repeated from the main story and with also some smaller ones added in. This game has an absolutely excessive amount of minigames, especially considering how sparse they were prior to Final Fantasy VII. For instance, gotta open a door? Press a button simultaneously with your team minigame. Gotta save a girl from drowning? CPR minigame. Stopping a train before it collides with the city? Train stopping minigame. Just watched a party member get impaled by the antagonist? Shred for maximum gnar, bro, in the snowboarding minigame. Time to march in a parade? Well, you get the idea. Final Fantasy VII really started, for better or for worse, the minigame apocalypse in RPG gaming. Going forward, almost every single mainline title would have a plethora of minigames thrown in them, whether they add to the experience or not. I personally love minigames that are well thought out and great distractions from the main story, such as Triple Triad or even Blitzball. But Final Fantasy VII is overloaded with mundane minigames that do not provoke thought or interest in gameplay. Much like quick-time events, if too often overused, they can go quickly from fun to miserable. Okay, I think I've spoken about as much as I can without really going into spoiler territory, so if you haven't played Final Fantasy VII, I would recommend that you do so first before watching the rest of this video. As much as I would love the watch time and the engagement potentially on the video, Final Fantasy VII truly is a game that you want to know as little as possible about the story before going into it. With that being said, here's a timestamp for the post-spoilers talk. And let's dive into the characters and story like the ground just collapsed and we are falling into the live stream. The opening to Final Fantasy VII is one of the most iconic cinematic intros in gaming. It begins with a lonely flower girl in an alleyway of a dark and technologically infused city named Midgar. The camera then pans over to a train where we meet our main protagonist, Cloud Strife, a mercenary who has been hired by Barret Wallace, the leader of an eco-terrorist organization called Avalanche. Now, I'm not going to go through every story beat in as much depth as this intro. I just wanted to highlight the gravitas of this introduction. So many JRPGs of the time start off with the stereotypical chosen one, clearing out some mundane task in their village before stumbling onto a sword, hidden ruin, or something otherwise prophetic that starts the hero along on their journey. Technically, Final Fantasy VII starts with the player committing some pretty serious felonies in the name of the planet. Not to mention the overall dark tone of Midgar. It reminds me kind of how Narshe felt at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI, but in this case it is fully realized in 3D. I cannot overstate how important this cutscene is. It immediately draws the player into this technical superiority of the PlayStation. Whenever a cutscene would happen, the player was ready, because they knew that they were in it for a treat. They could hear that disc whir up to speed and they knew they were in for something truly magical. Something that Final Fantasy VII arguably did the best in the franchise is its super bosses. In previous entries, the super bosses, when present, would be a random encounter, a chest opened, or something else otherwise inconsequential. Added to all versions of Final Fantasy VII after the Japanese original release, The Ruby and Emerald weapons are no pushovers. Personally, I feel that they are the perfect difficulty for a super boss. Both super bosses require some planning and preparation to defeat successfully. Emerald weapon is at the bottom of the ocean, and there's a 20-minute timer that the player must finish the encounter in order to be successful. There's an item that may help to defeat the Emerald weapon, the guidebook, which can be traded for the underwater materia, which eliminates the timer for defeating the boss. I don't know if this was the developer's intention, but most players only knew about this item from reading the strategy guide to learn of its existence, as you have to use the morph skill on the rare enemy to unlock it. Ruby weapon has attacks that would remove characters from the battle and will only expose its tentacles, allowing for it to be damaged when there's one character alive. This is a battle of attrition, as Ruby weapon has a staggering 800,000 hit points. To put this gargantuan HP pool into perspective, Safer Sephiroth, which is the final form of Sephiroth, has anywhere between 80,000 and 400,000 hit points, depending on how many characters you have at level 99 and if you've used Knights of the Round on the Jenova synthesis fight. On top of the inherent feeling of pride and accomplishment for downing these two super bosses, they will reward the player with some awesome loot. For defeating the Ruby weapon, the player will receive the Desert Rose, which can be traded for a gold chocobo, allowing for traversal to anywhere on the overworld. If the player downs the Emerald weapon, they receive the Earth Harp, which can be traded for a Master Magic, Command, and Summon materia, which essentially allows the equipped character to cast every spell and/or use every skill. Besides having the challenge of the super bosses and the great rewards, one of my personal favorite aspects to them is just how they're built into the narrative. Knowing that these two colossal beasts are in the world just adds to the tension, and if you are anything like me, you have accidentally run into Emerald weapon while underwater, or Ruby weapon while flying dirty and damn near straight shit yourself. If you ever beat the super bosses in Final Fantasy VII, be like Paula Abdul and straight up now tell me in the comments. Did you cheese it with some crazy strat you found on the internet like glitching hero drinks? Or did you make like Fleetwood Mac and go your own way? Side note, chances are if you're watching this video, you have probably either played and or beaten Final Fantasy VII, or at least familiar with most of the story beats. So I just wanted to highlight some aspects that are unique to this game. On my first playthrough, it took me a solid 10 hours to get out of Midgar. At the end of the game's first act, the player leaves Midgar for the first time, and you get a glimpse of how large the world actually is. I always felt that when the player first arrives in Calm and Cloud tells the story of the events of Nibelheim as one of the best narratively written moments in the game. And it does a great job of setting up one of my personal favorite writing conventions, the unreliable narrator. The pacing of the story is another highlight for Final Fantasy VII. It really is very similar to a play or movie, as events would continue to build and build until finally the act culminates in some epic fashion, typically revolving around death. For instance, the first act culminates with the death of the president of Shinra and the explosive escape of Midgar for our heroes. Act 2 ends in the death of Aerith and the party dealing with feelings of revenge and grief. Although characters have died in previous Final Fantasies, Aerith's death definitely is the most impactful one up to this point. Personally, I think what makes it so devastating is her character's innocence and overall happy demeanor. Much like Sephiroth, the moment comes out of nowhere and drives a sword through your gut. One can argue that General Leo's death in Final Fantasy VI, or perhaps 𝐂𝐓's death in Final Fantasy V, are as impactful as Aerith's, but I would disagree. Aerith at this point had been in the player's party for a majority of the playthrough. She was a key piece in many of the story beats that had led to this point. The subtext this entire time is that Cloud was Aerith's bodyguard and that he would repay her a date, but he failed, and she died, twisting the metaphorical knife deeper into the player's heart. Aerith's theme continues to play during the boss fight with Jenova that occurs immediately after her untimely demise. This specific scene would go on to become arguably the most notorious character death in all of gaming, and for me, is one of the scenes that cemented video games as a viable narrative device. Overall, the story of Final Fantasy VII is one of the strongest in the franchise to date. It draws strong parallels to some real-life concerns towards the environment, and also continues the theme of loss that was very present in Final Fantasy VI. As stated earlier, Final Fantasy VII was quite possibly the most influential game behind the original Mario Bros. In what it did for gaming. The game sold over 2 million copies in 3 days in Japan. When all said and done, on January 31st of 2023, it was said that the game's total sales had surpassed 14 million. Final Fantasy VII is the second best-selling game on the PlayStation, behind Gran Turismo by roughly 800,000 units. The legacy that Final Fantasy VII left shaped RPGs and cinematic storytelling in video games. BioWare founder 𝐂𝐎𝐍𝐍𝐄𝐂𝐓 cited Final Fantasy VII as the first really emotional, engaging game that had a big impact on BioWare's work. Now, I could cite a lot more quotes from other prolific game developers on how Final Fantasy VII shaped and inspired their creations for literally decades to come, but I don't want to belabor the point. I will mention, though, that in the Smithsonian Art of Video Games exhibit held in 2012, Final Fantasy VII won a poll to have it included in the exhibition. So, is Final Fantasy VII the best Final Fantasy in the franchise? Well, I leave that answer to you. But to quote Pro Jared, it may not be the best, but it is the most important. So is Final Fantasy VII worth playing today? Personally, I still think the game is a smooth experience that holds up well from a gameplay perspective, and although some of the visuals leave some details to be desired, it is perfectly serviceable. With how much Final Fantasy VII universe is blown up, from books to sequels to prequels to remakes to movie, I feel like anyone curious about the universe of Final Fantasy VII should definitely give it a go. There really isn't a bad way to experience the game, and the original is even available on phones now. So pick your poison and enjoy. As usual, thank you so much to my patrons for your continued support. I apologize that it's taken me this long to get this video out, but I mean, it's Final Fantasy VII. It's worth the time. Don't worry, this won't be the last time that we talk about Final Fantasy VII also. In fact, the next 4 videos I produce will still be in Final Fantasy VII's universe. So until the reunion, my fellow children of Jenova, praise be to Yevon. Like Spider-Man!